So far, we have discussed some historical overview of storytelling, and we have gone through some evidence that storytelling is probably an art which is as old as the evolution of human or Homo sapiens. Now let's see what storytelling is exactly. It's not very easy to define storytelling because there are many definitions which are available out there. But we know that storytelling is the social and cultural activity of sharing stories, which are sometimes accompanied with improvisations, embellishments, etc. And every culture has its own stories or narratives, and these narratives and stories are shared as a means of entertainment, sometimes for cultural preservation, for educational purposes, or sometimes for instilling moral values. Uh, there are crucial elements of stories, which I touched on in the previous video, which include characters, plots, viewpoints, settings, etc. Now, storytelling has been defined in various ways. One of the definitions, which was proposed by this researcher, Sue, uh, is this: the use of voice, facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, and interaction to connect a tale with listeners. I think we have a lot to talk about when it comes to voice, facial expressions, and other attributes which have been highlighted by this researcher. But also, another very important point here is the term tale itself, because it has not been defined explicitly in this definition, but we need to know what a tale is. In my opinion, a tale refers to what I have already covered in other videos, and that includes genres of spoken text, particularly these four: narratives, anecdotes, exemplums, and recounts. So when we are talking about storytelling, we are referring to uh, the use of these attributes or these abilities and features, voice, facial expressions, etc., in order to connect any of these types of spoken genres with a group of audiences. Another definition is proposed by McDrury and Alterio, which, in my opinion, is not as detailed as the first one, but it's interesting to review. Storytelling, according to them, is uniquely a human experience that enables us to convey, through the language of words, aspects of ourselves and others and the world, real or imagined, that we inhabit. Now, here, as you see, we've got the word aspects of ourselves and others. Well, basically, aspects of ourselves and others can either, as they also mentioned, that can be either created or they can refer to the world around us. In either way, we need to find the traces of this ability to create that imaginary world or to retrieve the information that we know about the real world in our brain. That is our long-term memory, and also in our synaptic areas, or synaptic self, as some people have referred to. Actually, there is also a book called The Synaptic Self. So this definition relies on our ability to create and retrieve the information in our working memory, in our long-term memory, and use that in our working memory, although they do not discuss these terminologies and these dimensions of storytelling. Now, what I would like to suggest here is that you watch the videos on listening and speaking, because I think storytelling has a lot to do with these two skills, especially oral storytelling. Now, the authors go on to say that stories enable us to come to know these worlds and our place in them, given that we are all, to some degree, constituted by stories. And the term story here is basically used in a very, very broad sense. We're constituted by stories. In my opinion, it means that we are constituted by our past experiences. And experiences could be emotional experiences, educational, cultural, social, all sort of experiences, psychological experiences that we have had in the past. So whatever we have accumulated over the years and have stored in our synaptic connections make make us, make who we are or what we are. And through storytelling, we can actually touch on some of those dimensions that we are aware of. The third definition, which has been proposed by Lukareschi, is also, I would say, as comprehensive as the first definition. And it goes like this: a process where a teller uses a narrative structure, vocalization, and/or dramatic and mental imagery to communicate with an audience, who also uses mental imagery to provide the teller, that's the storyteller, with verbal and nonverbal feedback. So we have quite a little bit of subtleties here. First of all, the author refers to the use of narrative structure. A narrative structure here is actually a very broad terminology that refers to all of the structures that we have talked about before. I'm going back to this slide. Genres of spoken text, including narratives, anecdotes, exemplums, and recounts, particularly these four, because during these four, you use vocalizations. You can imitate someone. The terminology that Delheims used in his formulation of communicative competence was the word key. And key refers to your ability to imitate through the tone and your language, the tone of your voice, the state of someone else's mind. If they're happy, you can imitate them. If they're sad, then you imitate their sadness and try to convey that state of mind to your audience. If you are talking about your grandfather, you can imitate how he speaks, or grandmother. This is vocalization, and it actually is a very powerful instrument that is available to all of us. But we need some training on that. The first few times when we try to use vocalization to convey the state of mind of someone to the audiences, we might feel awkward. We might feel that I didn't do a good job. That's right. I think it can happen to everyone, because I think we're not born with this natural ability to be able to imitate anyone and everyone around us. It needs practice. So the other terminology is or dramatic and mental imagery to communicate with the audience. Well, that's right. Visual mental imagery is a very important aspect of our communication, especially our listening comprehension, because at some point during the listening process, what we hear and understand is transferred to certain parts of the brain, and then is transformed to what we call a visual mental imagery. And some scholars also argue, like Walter Kinch, that the message is not only transformed into visual mental imagery, but also what he refers to as propositions, which are not linguistic. Now, the topic here is visual mental imagery, so I don't want to digress from that. There is a lot of research on visual imagery, and I personally published a paper on the importance of visual mental imagery in listening comprehension and its impact and its predictive power of listening comprehension. If the narrator of a story, that's the storyteller, has the ability and the skills to induce powerful visual mental imageries in the audience, to evoke clear imageries in the audience, he would be more successful in conveying the message that he wants to convey to the audience. But if the visual mental imagery is not properly generated because the storyteller doesn't have the skills to create them, to create all dimensions of imageries in the mind of the listener, then I think the storytelling will probably not be as successful as a scenario where the person is able to evoke imageries in the mind of the listeners. Imageries have different dimensions. In that paper I have discussed it. I'll leave the link in the comments section for you if you're interested to read that paper. So we need to take into account those dimensions of imageries and try to work on them, try to practice creating those dimensions in the mind or in the brain of the listener. Now it goes on, the audience, with an audience who also uses mental imagery to provide the teller with verbal and nonverbal feedback. Yes, verbal and nonverbal feedback is important. Generally speaking, feedback is important in storytelling. Of course, when it comes to digital storytelling, this verbal nonverbal feedback is mostly not immediate or online. We may receive feedback later. For example, if we create a digital story and we upload it on YouTube, then people can write things, their ideas, their evaluations in the comment section of the video. That's one sort of feedback for us. But when it comes to live storytelling, the sort of uh, subtle nonverbal feedback like gestures, body language, like the share of eye contact that you receive from your audience can tell you things as to whether they are deeply engaged in your storytelling or they're not interested in the story that you're telling them. Those pieces of information that we receive from our environment or the context in which we're telling the story also constitute one part of storytelling. So here, this definition of storytelling makes storytelling something interactive, which reminds me of the model of interactional competence, which I have covered in previous videos. Well, I'm not going to go through this, but it's important to synthesize this definition with what we have learned previously. And one last thing about storytelling before I move on to the next slide is that in storytelling we use language improvisation. We use vocalization, as I mentioned just right now, and mimetic action in our creativity. Mimetic action is our ability to mimic other people, how they walk, how they share gestures and body language, the sort of facial expressions that they would put on, and those kind of things. For example, if you want to say that someone was sad after hearing something, you need to imitate the sadness not only through your voice, but also through your facial expressions and your body language in order to make that storytelling act more powerful. So, and the rest of this should be read as well. And our creativity to convey a story message to our audience. Creativity is important as well. So you see, if you look at the keywords that I have identified and emboldened in these two, and actually some of them have been already reiterated, like improvisation, vocalization, I think they can give us some sort of definition for storytelling and also highlight the important dimensions of storytelling. Now, what I would recommend that you do is to do these two activities. In activity one, try to link these frameworks. One framework is the interactional competence framework right here. The other one is the model, which was model of speaking, which was proposed by Bygus in 2011 or 2009. One of those two years actually is right here. It's too small for me to see. And then spoken genre, it's right here. The spoken genre I've already gone through, and they include recounts, narratives, anecdotes, etc., and the storytelling itself. Storytelling definitions that I have discussed. Try to create a link between them and synthesize them. They don't have to be this separate, because everything within these frameworks and models have to do with the idea of communication, or what we call interactional or communication competence. So although they are on the face of it, they are separate and distinct from each other, they actually have a lot in common, and we need to synthesize those commonalities. The second activity is based on your discussion. If you have a friend or colleague to discuss with, try to create a synthesized framework for storytelling based on these. This will be very helpful as well, because you would create a coherent and cogent framework based on everything that we have covered so far. So let's finish this video at this point. I would also like to add that I'm not using my usual microphone. I'm not sure if my voice quality is the same as the voice quality in the first video of this series that I've made. I hope it's still audible and you can follow me. Thank you very much.